Bookstores were dangerous places in post-war America, places where an innocent youth browsing might glimpse something that would ruin his life forever. Of all the publications on the rack, nothing was more dangerous than the muscle mags. They were ostensibly about strength and health and bodybuilding, but in fact delivered a very different message. What follows is a brief survey of some photographers, publishers, and fans of Physique magazines and how the forces of morality tried to stem the tide. On Sundays, Alonzo Hanagan was a mild-mannered church organist, but weekdays he was Lawn of New York, physique photographer. Here you see him at the beach with some of his models. That's Lawn, third from the left, with the pant legs rolled up. He worked with Italian, Puerto Rican, and black models, unusual in the muscle business of the day. The columns and the fig leaf were meant to remind viewers of classical statues. In 1942, Lawn released his first catalog. Soon this attracted the attention of the postal inspectors, and the police raided his studio. They seized prints, negatives, and equipment. He paid a fine. Another time he was with one of his models when the police burst in. He described what happened. They threw negatives on the floor and trampled them, destroyed prints, and took us both to jail. They said, "You degenerate, you queer, people like you should be annihilated." The judge said $5,000 or 5 years in jail. Lawn borrowed the money and paid the fine. In 1961, he was raided again. The police found a photograph showing a single pubic hair peeping out of the strap. For that, he was arrested again and briefly jailed. His landlord told him to go find another place to live. After that, he quit photography work and made his living as an organist and piano teacher. By the 1990s, his photographs were being presented in art exhibitions, and today they fetch fancy prices at auctions. Bob Mizer got out of Idaho as soon as he could and headed for Los Angeles. In 1942, when he was only 20, he began sending out photographs. Some of his models, Arnold Schwarzenegger, for example, went on later to have successful careers. Mizer gave his operation the grand name of the Athletic Model Guild. In 1945, he received a visit from the postal inspectors who searched his room and found incriminating pictures. He managed to avoid prosecution that time, but in 1947 he did 6 months at a prison farm after it turned out that one of his models was only 17 years old. In 1951 he launched his flagship publication, Physique Pictorial, which ran quarterly until 1990. Mizer also sometimes lent out lists of his models with telephone numbers, and in 1968 he was arrested by the Vice Squad for running a prostitution ring. Following that, Mizer was not seen for a while, and Physique Pictorial skipped publication for a couple of issues, but it was soon again on the newsstands. When Mizer died in 1992, he left a collection of something like 2 million still images, plus a number of films and videotapes. They are studied at universities and published in books. A foundation has been set up to conserve them, and many of them can be seen on YouTube's Bob Mizer Foundation channel. This news report is from Madison, Wisconsin in 1948. The lead says, 2 Madison men were arrested Tuesday night on morals charges after police raided their home and discovered a huge supply of obscene literature and other evidence indicating unnatural sexual activities. Eventually, a dozen men were implicated, including 4 students at the University of Wisconsin. Judge Roy H. Proctor was a lenient judge and sentenced them only to 1-year suspended sentences. But he warned them that if there was a second offense, they should not expect leniency. Chuck Renslow founded Chris Studios in Chicago in 1950. In 1958, the studio was raided, and Renslow was charged was sending obscene materials through the mails. The obscenity was that you could see certain shapes beneath the skimpy scraps of cloth that draped his models. The indictment called it excessive genital delineation. Renslow beat the rap. Later, he privately admitted that he had poured water on the straps, the better to make them cling. He was arrested again in 1966 on obscenity charges, but that time the case was dismissed. Renslow and his lover, Dom Orejudos, built an entire industry catering to the leather community with bars, bathhouses, contests, and awards. By the time he died at the age of 87, he was a beloved civic figure in his hometown. A street was named after him, and the Chicago Tribune called him a gay community icon. In 1959, 13 detectives and 4 postal inspectors smashed a lewd male photo ring in Greenwich Village. 7 men were booked on pornography charges. The officers seized 120,000 photos, negatives, and lewd sketches, and arrested 3 photographers, a photo finisher, and a printing supervisor. After the initial raid, the police proceeded to the ring's warehouse at 19 Jones Street. The newspaper says, behind false walls there, they found additional piles of photos, advertising brochures, and mailing lists containing about 100,000 names. One of them apparently a woman. Police said many of the addresses were those of armed forces personnel. Al Arvin had lots of trouble with the law. He was arrested and jailed in 1947 for sending nude photos through the mail. Arrested again in 1956 and fined $5,000 with a 20-year suspended sentence. His camera kept clicking, and he published work in Bob Miser's Physique Pictorial and Lynn Womack's Tomorrow's Man. In 1960, Arvin's studio was raided by police, who seized his prints and negatives and charged him with possession of obscene materials. He was sentenced to a year and served 3 months at hard labor before the possession charge was overturned on appeal. That effectively ended his career. Most of his work was destroyed, and he died in poverty. Newton Arvin taught for 38 years at Smith, the elite women's college in Massachusetts. He published acclaimed studies of American literature. He was a friend of Carson McCullers. Sylvia Plath was a student of his. Arvin was Truman Capote's first lover. Here are Truman and Newton in those happy days. In 1960, the Massachusetts State Police busted Arvin for possession of obscene photos. The professor broke down and confessed to having copies of Grecian Gill Pictorial and Vim in his apartment, to showing them to others, and even to swapping them. He pleaded guilty and paid a fine of $1,200. He got a 1-year suspended sentence and probation. Smith College suspended him from teaching, but kept him on at half salary. He was admitted to a state hospital for suicidal depression. After Arvin's death at the age of 63, Truman Capote established an award in his memory. Smith College established the Newton Arvin Prize in American Studies. His story was turned into an opera, The Scarlet Professor, shown here in rehearsal at Amherst College. Lynn Womack was a philosophy professor before he became a physique publisher, so he understood the importance of principles. He appealed his obscenity conviction all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and won an important victory for gay equality. The lower court had ruled that Manual, Vim, and Grecian Gill Pictorial were obscene because they were intended for homos. The Supreme Court found that male nude pictures cannot fairly be regarded as more objectionable than many portrayals of the female nude. That is to say, beefcake photos have equal rights. It was the first case involving homosexuality ever argued before the Supreme Court, and it laid the foundation for all the equal rights decisions that have followed. Lynn Womack had a truly remarkable life. He was an albino, born in Mississippi to sharecrop farmers. He earned a master's degree in psychology at the George Washington University. He married, divorced, and then married again before he understood he was gay. Then he abruptly changed the whole course of his life. He put in 10 years of study and earned a philosophy doctorate at Johns Hopkins and taught philosophy at the George Washington University. Next, he made $500,000 in a fraudulent stock boosting scheme. The investigators did not charge him, and he got to keep the money. He used it to buy a printing plant and began issuing bodybuilder mags. All was well until 1960, when he was convicted on obscenity charges and sentenced to 1 to 3 years. While he was out on appeal, the Moral Squad raided his printing plant again, and again he was brought up on obscenity charges. The judge gave him an extra 4 to 14 months. He did his time at the St. Elizabeth Psychiatric Hospital, where he had a room and a typewriter, and simply continued to operate his business. Meanwhile, he appealed the original conviction all the way to the Supreme Court and won the decision, Manual Enterprises versus Day. In 1970, Womack was arrested again. This time he copped a plea and retired. DSI got rid of the posing straps. Direct Sales Incorporated, or DSI, was founded in 1963 in Minneapolis by Conrad Germain and Lloyd Spinar. Their first magazine, Butch, debuted in 1965, and within a year it was selling 50,000 copies per issue. In 1967, DSI's publishing plant was raided. Germain and Spinar were charged with 29 counts of sending lewd material through the mail. They assembled a formidable roster of expert witnesses, including Wardell Pomeroy of the Kinsey Institute, Dr. Walter Alvarez of the Mayo Clinic, and Harold Cole and Richard Leach of the Mattachine Society. In a landmark decision, a federal judge agreed that the intended market might be a deviant group, but the accused were not guilty. The rights of minorities expressed individually in sexual groups or otherwise must be respected, the judge wrote. When the Los Angeles Advocate began publication 2 months later, the DSI decision was page 1 news. One Confidential also featured it, and Germain and Spinar announced it as well in their own publication, Unique. It marked the end of an era, because with the DSI decision, the Physique magazines cast off their last fig leaf, and full frontal nudity publications took over the market. The models were looking less like bodybuilders and more like trade.